When someone shows me a new Yu-Gi-Oh card, there's a lot of elements that need to be looked at before deciding if the card is good or bad or just mediocre. Now, the first thing that I always look at is the effect of the monster. That usually is what matters the most out of anything. Then I might look at the name to see if it falls in an archetype, followed by maybe the type and attribute and levels to see if I can do anything interesting with those attributes. And then finally, after all of that, I look at the attack and defense. And this kind of goes along with my idea that the attack points on Yu-Gi-Oh cards and the defense points as well don't really matter. And in today's video, we're going to talk about why attack points have sort of mattered less and less as the game's history has gone on, and also why this is different than other card games. And then at the end of it, I do want to mention some situations where attack stats and defense stats actually do matter, because it's incorrect to say that they don't matter ever, they just don't matter a lot. There are two major reasons that I think the attack and defense points on a monster card don't matter that much in most situations. Now, the first reason is that Yu-Gi-Oh has so many different ways to remove cards off of the board, and this is really important because way back in the day this wasn't so much in ample supply. I mean, yeah, we had spell cards like Regeki and Dark Hole, but pretty much all of the spot removal that were on Yu-Gi-Oh cards were found in the effects of spell cards. But nowadays pretty much every single archetype you look at is going to have some form of removal, not only the competitive strategies but also the rogue strategies as well. And I might even go as far to say that even casual strategies usually have at least one or two forms of spot removal just sort of guaranteed when anyone builds a deck list, which means that no matter how high the attack stats of a card are, a lot of times you can just get rid of it outside of the means of battle, which is pretty different from a lot of games. The second reason that attack points might not matter is that the extra deck exists in Yu-Gi-Oh and not in other card games. So when I think about other card games, pretty much the monsters in your main deck are going to be what you're attacking with turn in and turn out, but in Yu-Gi-Oh that's not really the case. And I think especially in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh, many of the decks out there, the main monster cards, the main deck monster cards at least, they're just stepping stones to get to the bigger extra deck ones, which don't have the downside of drawing them at inopportune times, and they often have really big effects and really big attacks. They're just good cards in general. And I know that there are going to be some sort of OG Yu-Gi-Oh fans that watch this video, and while I do understand your perspective, the fact of the matter is that we've had synchro summoning for 10 years now, so it's kind of silly to say, oh, Yu-Gi-Oh has gone in the direction of extra deck summoning only recently, because actually at this point the majority of Yu-Gi-Oh has been extra deck focused. Now obviously the focus has changed a little bit over those 10 years with synchro monsters, but even still, synchro monsters back in the day did have really good effects and a lot of attack points, and you could consolidate a tuner monster and another monster into those bigger monsters, which is very similar to what we're seeing nowadays with Exceed summoning and Link summoning. So this makes a huge difference compared to other card games, because in other card games, whatever monsters you have in your main deck, that's what you're going to be attacking your opponent's monsters with. But in Yu-Gi-Oh, many decks actually just have the end goal of getting a whole bunch of little monsters on the board as easily as possible, only to upgrade into those stronger extra deck monsters, which means that there isn't a huge weight on the attack points of main deck monsters, because you're not really going to be using them for attacking anyway. Despite these two reasons, and also despite the fact that I said at the beginning of this video that the attack and defense stats are the last thing that I look at when I'm looking at a new card, I'm not really saying that attack points never matter. So I'm going to mention some points when they actually do matter. Now, the number one area that I feel that attack points actually do come up in is when you're trying to bait a big monster's effect before you actually make your main play. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I saw this happen a lot when Masterpiece and Zodiac Trident were in the game. Zodiac Trident usually going to have a lot of attack points, which is a little different from Masterpiece, which did have a lot of attack points. But in both cases, one of the best ways to actually bait those effects was to simply summon a monster that could attack over them, because that kind of forced them to use their destruction effects on whatever monster had all those attack points. Now, Zodiac Trident often was sort of supplied with the extra benefit of Zodiac Whiptail, giving it the option to banish something that attacked it. But if you summon something that could somehow dodge that Whiptail effect, they often had to waste the Dryden effect to try to destroy whatever you summoned that could just run over their monster. And also, they didn't always have the Whiptail. I mean, oftentimes they did because they just searched it with Broad Bowl, but in the cases that they didn't have Whiptail, they were actually forced to use that Dryden effect unless they wanted it to be run over by battle and then completely miss out. And in the case of Masterpiece, it's a little different because oftentimes that card was protected somewhat from Dragonic Diagram, but in the cases where they attributed a spell card to summon it, they didn't have that extra attack points, they didn't have that extra protection effect, which means that if you summon a monster with more than 2950 attack, your opponent was pretty much forced to actually use the Masterpiece before you just ran it over in battle. So I think one of the best scenarios where attack points actually really do matter is when you're trying to push through a board without using your own effects and hopefully bait your opponent into using their destruction effects or their negation effects so that you don't just run those cards over in battle. The other example where you really want to have attack points is when the deck actually doesn't have a ton of spot removal. Now this might not seem like it comes up a lot in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, and that certainly is true, but I think of the pre-Sky Striker variant of Trickstars where pretty much their only form of removal in the entire main and extra deck was Borreload Dragon, which they had to hard draw the unsearchable 3 of Scapegoat to actually make. And this actually led many Trickstar players, and even myself in some of my rogue strategies, to play the card Eater of Millions. Now I've talked about that card in another video where Eater of Millions really shouldn't be that good of card, but the fact remains that Eater of Millions is a free level 1 monster that was a really good 1-for-1 piece of spot removal every single turn, and the only reason Eater of Millions was played was because the decks it was being played in lacked spot removal, such as Trickstars before the Sky Striker. If you wondered why Eater of Millions was so good in that strategy, it's because the Trickstar cards themselves are so tiny and they have no spot removal effects, so much so that in deck profiles, even to this day, as recently as the Triff Gaming Pendulum deck profile, he literally says if you summon a Chronograph Sorcerer, which has 2000 attack, Trickstars actually can't out it because it's too big. And I'm not going to say to the extreme cases that that's actually true, but in many cases that actually does work out. I recently talked about my Altergeist deck profile where I played Cyber Dragon, and one of the reasons that I played Cyber Dragon is because Trickstars actually still, even with the Sky Striker cards, have issues outing those big monsters, and the Cyber Dragon can easily rank up into the 2400 attack fusion monster, which makes it even harder to deal with, even if the monsters that are bigger than the Trickstar monsters don't have protection effects. It just, Trickstars have a really tough time dealing with those strategies. So it's not often that the top deck doesn't have a ton of ways to remove monsters. I think in the past, usually the top decks have a variety of ways to do that. If we think back to Zoo, they had not only Whiptail, but also Trident and tons of other ways to actually get cards off the board. But in the format like the one that we're in right now, where the best deck, or one of the best decks, simply doesn't have a lot of ways to remove cards, well then high attack points are definitely going to matter. And I can kind of think of the opposite as someone that's played Altergeist. One of the biggest issues is that the two main Trickstar monsters, Lycoris and Candina, both of them, well, in Lycoris's case, it is equal to the highest attack point of all the Altergeist cards, but in Candina's case, there's no Altergeist main deck monsters that actually can deal with that card without going into the extra deck, which makes a big difference because one of the forms of spot removal in Altergeist is the Kieran card that bounces cards back to the hand, but you don't want to bounce Candina back to the hand, which means if you want to remove those cards from the field effectively, you pretty much have to use the level 1 Altergeist monster, but you don't always have access to that card, and the Trickstar deck is obviously really good at applying pressure, so if you don't draw that card immediately, you're in for a rough time. So even in the case of Altergeist, just a few hundred attack point difference on several of the cards. I think even if just Marionetta had 1900 attack points, that matchup would be infinitely easier, but once again, this is a case where the strategy doesn't have a ton of spot removal outside of the level 1 monster, very similar to the old Trickstar decks that only had the Scapegoat into Borreload or the Eater of Millions to remove one monster at a time. But that pretty much wraps up this discussion. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Once again, again, I wasn't trying to say that attack points never matter. I was trying to go through some examples of why attack points are usually the last thing to look at, but that they do still come up. I remember old zoo format before we had the Norden combo, a lot of people mentioned that Fire Formation Tenki was super crucial in the mirror match because it made everything 100 points bigger than your opponent's monsters, which meant that some of them were pretty tough to deal with. People talked about how they would just summon multiple copies of Thoroughblade. They had 1700 attack if you had a Tenki up, and that was actually pretty hard to out in the mirror match outside of making Zodiac Trident, but even making Trident just to pop a Thoroughblade wasn't the greatest play. You would want to get a little more value out of it than just that. But I hopefully you guys knew this discussion. I will see you later. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know some cases that you've come across where attack points really don't matter or where attack points actually mattered a lot. I will see you guys later. Bye.